I want you to start with a simple picture in your mind. You are standing at your kitchen sink after a big greasy meal. There is a pan sitting there coated in oil, and you reach for the dish soap. You squeeze a little onto the surface and watch what happens. The soap does not scrub the grease away with force. It dissolves it. It chemically strips that protective layer right off the surface of the pan as if it was never there to begin with. Now hold that image. Hold it carefully, because what I am about to share with you is that the exact same process, that exact same chemical action, is happening inside your gut right now. It has probably been happening every single day for years. And the most unsettling part is that almost nobody knows about it. There is an ingredient, or rather a family of ingredients, so deeply buried in the modern food supply that most people have never once stopped to question it. It hides on ingredient labels behind long chemical names that the average person skips right over without a second thought. And according to a growing and serious body of scientific research, it may be one of the most quietly destructive things that people in the modern world are doing to their own bodies on a daily basis. Here is the part that still surprises me every time I think about it. When I tell you what this ingredient is, you have almost certainly heard the word before. You may have seen it on a label just this morning, but you had no idea, absolutely no idea, what it was actually doing inside you while you were eating it. That we are talking about emulsifiers. Chemical compounds added to processed food for one reason and one reason only: to force oil and water to mix together. That is their entire purpose. They make processed food look smoother and feel creamier in your mouth. They extend shelf life and maintain a uniform texture for months at a time. From the food manufacturer's perspective, emulsifiers are a dream ingredient. From your body's perspective, the story is very different. Emulsifiers do not stop working when they leave the food and enter your body. They keep doing exactly what they were chemically designed to do, and that is dissolve protective barriers. Only now, the barrier they are working on is not an emulsion in a bottle of salad dressing. It is the thin, delicate, irreplaceable layer of mucus that lines your intestines and stands between the trillions of bacteria living in your gut and your bloodstream. Emulsifiers are estimated to be present in roughly 60% of all packaged foods currently sitting on grocery store shelves. 60%. That includes ice cream and chocolate bars. It includes salad dressing and plant-based milks. It includes bread, protein bars, peanut butter, coffee creamer, and mayonnaise. And yes, it includes baby formula. The majority of people consuming these products multiple times every day have no understanding of what those emulsifiers are doing to the inside of their gut. That is what this script is going to change. Section 2. What emulsifiers are and why they are in everything. Let us build a clear picture of what an emulsifier actually is, because understanding the chemistry is what makes everything else click into place. Think about the last time you made a simple salad dressing at home. You poured olive oil into a jar, added lemon juice or vinegar, maybe some salt and herbs, and no matter how hard you shook that jar, the oil and the liquid separated within seconds. The oil floated right back to the top. That is not a mistake or a failure. That is simply how oil and water behave together in nature. They do not mix. The chemical properties of each substance make them fundamentally incompatible. For your home kitchen, this is just a minor inconvenience. But for a food manufacturing company trying to produce tens of millions of units of a product that needs to look perfectly smooth, feel uniformly creamy, and remain stable on a shelf for 6 months or more, that natural separation is an enormous commercial problem. It makes the product look broken. It makes it feel wrong. It destroys the illusion of quality that the brand depends on. And so emulsifiers were introduced to solve this problem. An emulsifier molecule has a split chemical identity. One end of the molecule is attracted to water. The other end is attracted to fat. When an emulsifier is added to a mixture of oil and water, it positions itself right at the boundary between the two, with one side anchored in the water and the other anchored in the fat. In doing so, it forces the two incompatible substances to blend into a stable, uniform mixture. The product becomes smooth. It becomes creamy. It stays mixed for months. The commercial problem is solved. The most commonly used emulsifiers in modern processed food include polysorbate 80, which you will also sometimes see labeled as polysorbate 20 or polysorbate 60. There is mono and diglycerides, which are fat-derived compounds found in an enormous variety of baked goods and processed foods. There is carboxymethyl cellulose, often listed simply as cellulose gum or CMC. There is carrageenan, derived from red seaweed, and particularly common in plant-based milks and dairy alternatives. And there are others, including lecithin, guar gum, xanthan gum, and locust bean gum, that appear regularly across the processed food landscape. These ingredients are present in foods that might genuinely surprise you. Commercial bread, something that has been made by humans for thousands of years using nothing more than flour, water, yeast, and salt, now routinely contains mono and diglycerides to achieve the right texture and extend shelf life. Commercial peanut butter stays perfectly smooth for months because emulsifiers are chemically preventing the natural separation that would otherwise occur. Natural peanut butter, the kind with no additives, separates. The oil rises to the top. That separation is not a defect. It is simply what happens when there are no chemicals forcing the product to behave differently. The critical thing to understand is that food manufacturers are not adding emulsifiers to make your food healthier or tastier. These chemicals exist purely to serve the commercial interests of the product, its appearance, its shelf stability, its production efficiency, and the profit margin behind it. From your perspective as the person eating that food, emulsifiers provide no benefit to you whatsoever. What they do provide, as the research is beginning to reveal, is a very specific kind of harm. Section 3. Your gut's first line of defense. To fully understand what emulsifiers do inside your body, you first need a clear picture of what a healthy, functioning gut actually looks like and what it is designed to accomplish. Your intestines are not simply passive tubes that food travels through on its way out of your body. They are a living, extraordinarily sophisticated biological ecosystem, one of the most complex and important systems in the human body. Inside your gut right now, there are approximately 38 trillion bacteria. To put that in perspective, that number exceeds the total count of human cells in your entire body. This vast community of microorganisms, collectively called your gut microbiome, plays a critical and active role in virtually every aspect of your health. Your digestion, your immune responses, your mental health, your metabolism, your ability to absorb nutrients, and even your mood and cognitive function are all shaped in significant ways by the health and composition of your gut microbiome. But here is the fundamental challenge. Those trillions of bacteria cannot be permitted to roam freely through your body. They belong in the gut. When they are where they are supposed to be, they are protective and essential. When they end up somewhere they are not supposed to be, in your bloodstream, in your tissues, they can cause serious harm. The body has evolved an elegant and sophisticated solution to this problem over millions of years of biological development. It is a wall, a thick, layered, chemically complex wall of mucus that lines the entire interior surface of your intestines. This mucus lining is not the kind of mucus associated with illness. It is not a symptom of anything going wrong. It is a highly specialized biological structure, a defense system of remarkable sophistication. On one side of this barrier live the trillions of bacteria that make up your microbiome. On the other side, your bloodstream and your immune system stand ready. The mucus layer is what keeps those two worlds permanently and safely separated. This barrier is not simply a passive wall. It actively controls what crosses from the gut into your bloodstream. It allows essential nutrients, vitamins, minerals, and beneficial compounds to pass through while simultaneously blocking pathogens, undigested proteins, bacterial fragments, and microbial toxins from entering your blood. When this barrier is healthy, thick, and fully intact, your body is remarkably well protected. The system works as it was designed to work. The consequences of its failure, however, are severe and far-reaching. And this is where emulsifiers enter the picture in the most troubling way. Emulsifiers are designed, at the deepest level of their chemical function, to dissolve the boundary between substances. That is what makes them commercially valuable. That is why they are added to food. But when those same compounds travel through your digestive system and reach your intestinal lining, they do not distinguish between the emulsion in a bottle of salad dressing and the protective mucus barrier of your gut. They encounter a barrier and they begin to dissolve it. Multiple independent studies have now demonstrated that common food emulsifiers measurably reduce the thickness of the intestinal mucus layer, shift bacteria physically closer to the intestinal wall, and begin to degrade the tight cellular junctions that seal the lining together. When those seals fail, we enter the territory of what scientists call increased intestinal permeability, and what most ordinary people have come to know by a more vivid, more visceral name. Leaky gut. Section 4. Leaky gut and the cascade of inflammation. Leaky gut sounds almost too simple, too casual, like something someone invented to sell supplements. But the underlying clinical phenomenon, increased intestinal permeability, is well documented, measurable, and increasingly understood to be a foundational factor in a staggering number of chronic health conditions that are exploding in prevalence across the modern world. Here is exactly what happens when the gut barrier breaks down. The bacteria that reside in your intestines, even the beneficial bacteria that are there to protect you, are only safe and tolerable when they remain on their side of the wall. Your immune system has learned to recognize them as gut residents. It has made a kind of biological peace with their presence in that location. But the moment those bacteria, or fragments of bacteria, or the chemical toxins they produce during their normal biological processes begin to cross through a compromised gut lining and enter your bloodstream, your immune system sees something it has never learned to tolerate. It sees foreign invaders, and it responds with immediate force. An immune response is triggered. Inflammatory signals flood the system. Your body mobilizes its defenses against particles that have escaped from the gut, particles that, had the barrier been intact and functioning normally, your immune system would never have encountered at all. At first, this immune activation is low-grade. It simmers beneath the surface. Many people feel nothing specific at this stage, or they notice only vague and easily dismissed symptoms. Some degree of bloating after meals. A heavy, foggy sensation that settles in an hour or so. After eating, foods that never used to cause any problem now seem to create discomfort or digestive upset. A general feeling of systemic heaviness and fatigue that does not have a clear explanation. These symptoms are extremely easy to dismiss. They are nonspecific. They come and go. They do not point clearly to any single cause. And millions of people live with them for years, sometimes for decades, without ever connecting them to something they are eating, let alone to a specific chemical ingredient in the food they eat every day. But the compounding problem is this. If the source of the gut inflammation is something you are consuming 3 or more times a day, every day of your life, that inflammation is never given a chance to resolve. The gut lining is damaged again before it has had the opportunity to repair itself. And over months and years of this repeated cycle, the inflammation stops being low-grade and starts doing real, structural damage. The lining of the colon thins. Scar tissue accumulates in the intestinal wall. The surface area available for nutrient absorption decreases meaningfully. The capacity to extract vitamins, minerals, and essential compounds from the food you eat becomes progressively impaired. And the immune system, locked into a state of perpetual activation, begins to lose the precision that defines healthy immune function. Researchers who dedicate their careers to gut health have a phrase they return to constantly. What starts in the gut does not stay in the gut. That simple statement contains one of the most important insights in modern medicine. The inflammation that begins in your intestines is not contained there. It travels through the bloodstream. It reaches every organ and every system in your body. And where it arrives and how it expresses itself determines which chronic condition you eventually develop. Section 5. What the science actually tells us. I want to be precise and honest here, because the science of emulsifiers and gut health is an area where it is genuinely easy to go further than the data actually supports. I am not going to do that. What I will do is walk you through exactly what the evidence shows, what it does not yet show, and why the picture that is emerging is serious enough that it demands your attention right now, even before the full picture is complete. The earliest substantial evidence came from carefully controlled animal studies. Researchers fed mice polysorbate 80, one of the single most widely used emulsifiers in the global food supply, along with carboxymethylcellulose, another extremely common additive. The results were striking. The mice developed metabolic syndrome, the cluster of metabolic dysfunctions that includes weight gain, impaired blood sugar regulation, and altered insulin sensitivity. Their gut microbiome compositions shifted significantly. And most relevantly, the bacteria in their intestines were found in measurably closer physical proximity to the intestinal wall, precisely what you would expect to see if the protective mucus barrier had been thinned by the emulsifiers. Animal studies are animal studies. the appropriate scientific caution applies. What happens in a mouse under controlled laboratory conditions does not automatically and directly predict what will happen in a human being eating a varied diet in the real world. Dosages in animal studies are sometimes higher than typical human dietary exposure. Metabolic pathways differ between species. Scientists who push back against the more alarming interpretations of this research have a legitimate point when they flag this gap in the evidence. But then came the human data. In 2024, a controlled human trial was published examining what happened to real people who consumed food containing a common emulsifier under carefully controlled experimental conditions. The findings were sobering. After just 2 weeks of emulsifier consumption, the participants showed measurable changes in the composition of their gut microbiomes. The bacterial populations shifted, and the bacteria moved physically closer to the intestinal wall, the same hallmark sign that had emerged from the animal studies, now confirmed in humans after only 14 days of exposure. 2 weeks, not 2 years, not 2 decades. 2 weeks of normal emulsifier consumption produced measurable, documented disruption of the gut microbiome in real human participants. Most people eating ultra-processed food in the modern world have been doing so not for 2 weeks, but for their entire lives. The broader epidemiological picture adds another layer of concern. Over the last 20 years, rates of irritable bowel syndrome have doubled in the populations where ultra-processed food consumption is highest. Autoimmune diseases are rising sharply across the developed world, with the steepest increases documented in countries that have most recently adopted ultra-processed food diets. Conditions including Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis, once considered genuinely rare, are now diagnosed in growing numbers year after year. The connection between all of these rising trends and the simultaneous explosion in emulsifier consumption is not proof of causation. Gut health is influenced by many factors, and intellectual honesty requires acknowledging that. But dismissing the correlation as purely coincidental, given the mechanistic evidence for how emulsifiers damage the gut lining, is equally unsupported by science. Section 6. The regulatory failure that let this happen. This is the part of the story that I find genuinely difficult to accept. Because if there are real and growing scientific concerns about the effects of emulsifiers on gut health, the question that follows immediately is obvious. Why are these compounds still in our food? Why has the regulatory system not acted? Why are these ingredients not subject to rigorous long-term safety testing before being fed to hundreds of millions of people every single day? The answer lies in a regulatory designation called GRAS. It stands for Generally Recognized as Safe, and it is one of the most consequential regulatory loopholes in the history of American food policy. On the surface, GRAS sounds like exactly the kind of protection a reasonable person would want. A federal designation, a safety standard, something that tells you a substance has been reviewed and cleared. The reality is very different, and it is important that you understand exactly how different it is. Under the GRAS system, food companies are permitted to self-certify their own ingredients as safe. They are not required to submit their safety assessment to the FDA for independent review. They are not required to conduct long-term human trials before introducing the ingredient to the food supply. They are not required to study the effects of chronic daily exposure over years or decades of consumption. In a very significant number of documented cases, the FDA does not even see the safety data that the company relied upon to make their determination. The company reviews the evidence internally, decides that the ingredient is generally recognized as safe, adds it to their products, and the process is complete. Most of the emulsifiers that are currently in widespread use across the global food supply were granted GRAS status based on short-term toxicity studies conducted in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The scientific question those studies were designed to answer was narrow and limited. Does this substance cause immediate, acute poisoning? If the answer was no, if animals fed the substance did not die or become severely ill within a short experimental window, the substance was considered safe for human consumption. Nobody asked what happens when a human being consumes that substance 3 or more times a day for 30 or 40 years. Nobody asked what chronic, cumulative exposure does to the gut microbiome over a lifetime. Nobody designed a study to test whether daily emulsifier consumption over decades might contribute to the epidemic of gut inflammatory diseases that we are now witnessing. those studies were never conducted. The food industry has no financial incentive to fund research that might produce answers unfavorable to their products. And the regulatory framework places the burden of proof nowhere near where it should be. This is not a conspiracy. There is no malicious intent driving this situation. What it is a regulatory system built for a different era, a simpler era of food science, and a less industrialized food supply that has simply never been updated to reflect what we now know about the complexity of gut biology and the long-term effects of dietary chemical exposure. The consequences of that failure are being felt throughout the bodies of the population it was supposed to protect. Section 7. The children we are failing most. Everything I have described so far is concerning for adults. But when I think about children, the concern reaches a different level entirely. Because children are not simply smaller adults with the same biology operating at reduced scale. Their gut ecosystems are still forming. Their immune systems are still being trained. And they are the single demographic most heavily exposed to the ultra-processed foods that carry emulsifiers. Picture a typical child's eating day in a modern Western household. Breakfast is a bowl of commercial cereal with milk. The mid-morning snack is a granola bar. Lunch includes crackers, processed cheese, and possibly chicken nuggets. The after-school snack is a flavored commercial yogurt. Dinner might involve a sauce from a jar or a packaged side dish. Dessert is an ice cream product of some kind. In every single one of those items, there is almost certainly at least one emulsifier. In many of them, there are multiple emulsifiers from different chemical families. The cumulative daily exposure for that child across a normal eating day is substantial, and that day repeats with minimal variation every day of their childhood and adolescence. What makes this so much more serious for children than for adults is the stage of development their gut is in. The first years of life, and particularly the first 1,000 days from conception through approximately age 2, represent a critical biological window for gut microbiome development. The bacterial populations that establish themselves during this window become the biological foundation on which that child's immune system is built. They shape metabolic function, neurological development, and the long-term immune behavioral patterns that will influence that person's health for the rest of their life. When you introduce chemicals that degrade the gut barrier and alter microbiome composition during this critical developmental period, you are not simply causing a temporary disruption that the body will recover from. You may be interfering with the biological architecture that child will live inside forever. Research has consistently linked early gut microbiome disruption to significantly elevated lifetime risk of allergies, asthma, eczema, autoimmune conditions, anxiety disorders, depression, and the metabolic diseases that emerge in early and middle adulthood. And then there is the question that I find the hardest to sit with. Infant formula. For millions of newborns around the world, infant formula is not a supplement or an occasional food. It is the entirety of their nutritional intake for the first months of their lives. It is everything. And commercial infant formula contains emulsifiers. A newborn's gut has never encountered any food substance of any kind. The microbiome is in its earliest and most critical stages of establishment. The intestinal barrier is brand new, delicate, and still developing. And the very first nutritional product that enters that gut contains chemical compounds whose long-term effects on gut biology were never studied in infants, and which we now have reason to believe degrade the mucus barrier and alter microbiome composition. No long-term safety trial was ever required before these compounds were added to products designed for newborns. Under the GRAS system, no such requirement existed. Section 8. How gut damage travels through your entire body. We have established that chronic gut inflammation does not stay in the gut. Now I want to follow that inflammation in detail, because understanding where it travels and what it does when it arrives is what reveals the true scope of what we are dealing with. Your gut houses between 70 and 80% of all the immune cells in your entire body. That single fact changes how you should think about everything related to gut health. Your immune system is not primarily a system of the blood or the lymph nodes or any other location people typically associate with immunity. It is overwhelmingly a gut system. When the gut is chronically inflamed, the immune system is perpetually primed for conflict. It is stuck in a state of elevated alert, consuming energy, releasing inflammatory signaling molecules into the bloodstream, and circulating those signals to every corner of your body. Over time, this sustained immune activation becomes counterproductive. The immune system, which in a healthy state distinguishes with extraordinary precision between the body's own tissues and foreign threats, begins under chronic inflammatory pressure to lose that precision. It starts producing responses against tissues it should recognize as self. Joints, the thyroid gland, skin, the gut lining itself. This is the mechanism by which autoimmune conditions develop. Conditions including rheumatoid arthritis, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, psoriasis, type 1 diabetes, and inflammatory bowel diseases. And it is not coincidental that every one of these conditions is rising in prevalence in countries where ultra-processed food consumption and the emulsifiers it carries have increased most dramatically. Now consider what happens in the brain. Your gut contains its own independent nervous system, a network of approximately 500 million neurons embedded throughout the walls of your intestines. This enteric nervous system communicates continuously and bidirectionally with your brain through the vagus nerve, a massive neural pathway running from the brainstem deep into the abdominal cavity. When the gut is inflamed, this communication is disrupted. Inflammatory molecules travel up the vagus nerve and arrive in the brain, and the brain responds as it responds to any biological threat, with stress signaling, reduced cognitive performance, and disruption to mood regulation. This is the biological mechanism behind brain fog, the specific, recognizable quality of mental impairment that so many people experience after eating and that they cannot quite explain. It is not general tiredness. It is a foggy, heavy, cognitively dulled state that settles in after meals and makes thinking feel effortful. That experience is not psychological. It is physiological. It starts in the gut and travels to the brain via a well-documented biological pathway. 90% of the body's serotonin, the neurotransmitter central to mood stability, emotional regulation, and a fundamental sense of well-being, is produced in the gut, not in the brain. When the gut microbiome is disrupted, serotonin production is disrupted with it. The implications of this for mental health are profound and are currently the subject of intense and serious scientific research. We may be looking at a generation of people experiencing clinical depression and anxiety disorders that are not primarily psychological in origin, but are rooted in the biological disruption of gut serotonin production caused by chronic dietary chemical exposure. Metabolically, the same disrupted microbiome that produces inflammation also affects how the body regulates blood sugar, responds to insulin, and manages body weight. The metabolic syndrome that appeared predictably in emulsifier-fed animals in laboratory studies mirrors the metabolic crisis that has been unfolding across ultra-processed food-consuming populations worldwide over precisely the same period that emulsifier consumption has been rising. Section 9. What you can do right now. Let us move from the problem to the solution. Because the good news is that the solution is clearer, more practical, and more accessible than most people expect. The first practical step is learning to recognize emulsifiers on food ingredient labels because they do not always announce themselves in obvious language. The most extensively studied and most concerning emulsifiers are polysorbate 80, also sometimes listed as polysorbate 20 or polysorbate 60, depending on the specific compound. Carboxymethylcellulose appears on labels as cellulose gum or simply CMC. Carrageenan is particularly common in plant-based milks, coconut cream products, and many dairy alternatives. Mono and diglycerides are present in an enormous range of breads, baked goods, and processed convenience foods. Additional emulsifiers to be aware of include xanthan gum, guar gum, locust bean gum, and soy or sunflower lecithin, which has a somewhat better safety profile than the synthetic emulsifiers, but remains worth noting as part of total additive consumption. However, I want to be genuinely honest with you about the practical limits of label reading as a strategy. If your approach to reducing emulsifier exposure is to stand in every grocery aisle carefully examining every ingredient list on every product you consider purchasing, that approach will exhaust you within a short period and you will abandon it. It is cognitively demanding, it is time-consuming, and it is ultimately unsustainable as a daily. The more effective strategy is simultaneously simpler and more powerful. Stop buying ultra-processed foods, not through willpower,
This is
not
delicious,
through
isn't
discipline
it?
or moral
Yeah. Can you
determination
pass the salad?
applied in the
Of
moment
course.
of temptation.
How's the water, sweetie?
It's
through the
good.
much more reliable
Yay,
mechanism
my favorite
of
fruits and
environment
veggies.
design. Here is what the
So
behavioral
crunchy
science
and
tells us
fresh.
clearly and consistently. Willpower is finite. It depletes throughout the day as you make decisions, manage stress, and navigate the demands of your life. By the time you are tired and hungry at the end of a long day, your capacity for deliberate, disciplined food choice is at its absolute lowest. And that is precisely the moment when temptation is strongest. If ultra-processed food is physically present in your home at that moment,
Morning.
you
These
will eat
carrots
it.
and tomatoes were
This is
picked
not a
fresh this
character
morning.
flaw.
They look wonderful.
It is
Are they
simply how
local?
human
Absolutely,
behavioral
from our farm
biology
just down the
works.
road.
But if it is
These
not in your
greens are
home,
thriving.
the calculus
They
changes
love this
entirely.
golden light.
Accessing
these
it
carrots are
requires a
ready.
deliberate decision to leave the house, travel to a store, and make a purchase. That friction is significant. Almost nobody does that when they are tired and it is late in the evening. The environment has made the unhealthy choice harder, and that friction is enough for most people to make a different choice. So the intervention happens upstream.
Fiber-rich
at the
diets
grocery
promote
store,
healthy, active
before
gut
you are
function,
in a
while
vulnerable
low-fiber
state.
diets lead to
You simply
sluggish,
do not
unhealthy
buy the
colons.
ultra-processed products. You do not bring them into your home. And when the craving comes, as it will, the practical barrier to acting on it is sufficient protection. This approach eliminates emulsifiers and simultaneously eliminates the dozens of other questionable additives that accompany them in ultra-processed food.
A new
replacing
study
them with
shows
whole
IBS
foods
rates
that
have doubled in
actively
20
support
years.
rather than
Scientists are
undermine your
investigating
gut
the role
health.
of food
Section
additives.
10. How the gut
These
heals
results show
and what
emulsifiers
TO do
significantly
next.
increase gut permeability.
I want to close
This
with
is a
what I
p-value
consider
less
the
than
most
0.01 indicating
important
strong
and most
evidence.
hopeful piece of this entire conversation. The gut heals. Given the right conditions, the intestinal lining has a
The emulsifier
remarkable
sample shows
capacity
increased
for
clustering.
regeneration.
This
Unlike
suggests
some
heightened
forms of
microbial
biological
interaction.
damage that accumulate irreversibly, the gut barrier can rebuild. The mucus layer can thicken again. The tight junctions that
Please
were
finish your meal.
compromised can
I'll collect the
reseal.
sample now.
The microbiome
almost
can
done.
recover
Thank you. I'll
diversity
take this to the
and
lab.
balance. The system can be restored, and the downstream consequences of gut inflammation can be progressively reversed. But that
After 2
healing
weeks of
requires
emulsifier
one
consumption,
foundational
bacterial
condition.
species move closer
You have
to
to
the
stop
intestinal
breaking
wall.
the gut before it has a chance to repair itself. The single most impactful step you can take is to substantially reduce or eliminate ultra-processed food consumption. This removes the source of the chronic insult. It stops the repeated daily damage before it can compound further, and it creates the biological space for recovery to begin. Everything else, every dietary addition and every lifestyle change that supports gut healing is most effective once this primary step has been taken. From that foundation, fermented foods
Class, let's
represent one
practice
of the
reading
most
labels.
powerful active
What's the first
supports for
ingredient?
gut
It
recovery.
says whole grain
Real
oats.
yogurt with
Perfect for a
live
healthy
and
breakfast.
active
Ready to
bacterial
chop the
cultures.
carrots?
Yes,
Kefir,
I'll do it.
kimchi, sauerkraut.
Great job. Nice and
kombucha.
steady.
These foods introduce
let's start
beneficial
chopping these fresh
bacteria
carrots.
directly
Got it. They
into the
smell
gut
amazing.
ecosystem.
Perfect. Now we'll add
They
them
help
to the pot. This is
repopulate
so
and
fun.
diversify the microbiome that emulsifiers and ultra-processed food have disrupted. Regular consumption of a variety of fermented foods, not any single product, but a diverse rotation, is associated with meaningfully greater microbiome diversity and stronger intestinal barrier function. Prebiotic foods
I stick to
feed
whole
and
foods,
strengthen
even
the
in this aisle of
bacteria
temptation.
already present in
My
your
cart's
gut.
full of fresh, healthy
Garlic,
choices.
onions, leeks, asparagus, oats, and slightly underripe bananas are among the richest sources of prebiotic fiber. When the beneficial bacteria in your gut are well nourished by prebiotic foods, they thrive. They outcompete harmful species for space and resources, and they produce short-chain fatty acids, particularly a compound called butyrate, that directly nourish and strengthen the cells lining your colon. A well-fed microbiome is a resilient microbiome. High dietary fiber, not from supplements,
This is the
but from
open,
a
irregular
diverse
crumb
range
of
of
real
whole plant
sourdough.
foods,
See the
is
fermentation?
the single
No
most
emulsifiers
consistently
needed.
supported dietary factor for gut microbiome health across the research literature. Every major study of the gut microbiome
First, pour in
finds
some
the
good
same
olive oil.
relationship.
Squeeze in fresh
Fiber
lemon juice for
diversity
brightness. Add
drives
chopped herbs and
microbiome
whisk it all
diversity.
together.
And microbiome diversity is the foundation of gut resilience, immune competence, and long-term health. Omega-3 fatty acids from fatty fish such as salmon, mackerel, and sardines, from flax seeds, and from walnuts have well-documented anti-inflammatory properties that can help calm a gut that has been in a state of chronic inflammatory activation. Adequate hydration supports the production
Time
and
to stir this
maintenance
natural
of the
peanut
gut's
butter.
mucus layer.
See? No chemicals,
Sufficient
just real
and consistent
texture.
sleep matters
so creamy and
significantly
delicious.
because chronic sleep deprivation has measurable negative effects on gut microbiome composition and diversity. Stress management is not peripheral to gut health, but central to it. Because the gut-brain axis runs
Eating
in
whole
both
foods my
directions,
whole life has
and
kept me
chronic
vibrant and
psychological
full of
stress
energy.
causes
I feel
measurable
as alive as
disruption
ever.
to gut barrier
I've had gut
function
problems
through
for years from all
well-documented
the processed
biological
food.
pathways.
But I'm learning
And
how to eat
regular
better
physical
now.
activity, even moderate
It's
and
been 6
consistent
months,
movement,
and my gut is
is
finally
reliably
healed. This kitchen
associated
is
with
my
greater
sanctuary,
gut
full of whole
microbiome
foods that nourish
diversity
me.
and a more robust intestinal barrier. Your gut is not simply a digestive organ. It is the biological foundation of your immune system, housing the majority of your immune cells and training them throughout your life. It is a primary producer of the neurotransmitters that shape your mood, your emotional regulation, and your cognitive clarity. It is a central regulator of your metabolism, your insulin sensitivity, and your body weight. The health of your gut is not a niche wellness topic. It is the substrate on which your overall health is
On the
built.
left, a healthy gut
The
trains immune cells
emulsifiers
for
in
precise attacks.
60%
On the right,
of
a
packaged
disrupted
foods
gut causes
represent a
confused,
genuine
ineffective
and
defenses.
growing
This
threat
research
to
shows
that
a strong
substrate.
gut-brain
The
connection.
regulatory
the data here
system
shows high
designed
diversity
to
reducing
protect us
anxiety by
from
40%.
exactly
So my
this
diet
kind
can
of
help?
long-term dietary
The results are
harm
in. Your
has
diversity
failed to
score has
keep
jumped to
pace with the
3.8.
science
Oh, that's
and with the
wonderful
transformation
news. I
of
was
the
so
food supply.
worried.
Most people consuming these chemicals daily have had no idea what they were doing to their gut. But you know now. And knowing is the foundation of everything that changes next. The solution does not require perfection. It does not require an extreme diet or an expensive supplement protocol or a dramatic lifestyle overhaul. It requires one clear and sustainable decision. Build a food environment in your home and in your daily life where whole, minimally processed food is the default. Where the foods that actively nourish and protect your gut are the ones that are most accessible when you are tired, hungry, and vulnerable to impulse. Where the foods that damage your gut require effort and deliberate choice to access. That one decision, made upstream and maintained consistently, removes emulsifiers and dozens of other
These
harmful
carrots and
additives
tomatoes were
from your
picked
daily
fresh this morning.
exposure.
They look wonderful.
It
Are they
replaces
local?
them with the
Absolutely,
fibers,
from our farm
the
just down the road.
phytonutrients, the beneficial bacteria, and the natural compounds that your gut was biologically designed to thrive on. And it sets in motion a process of recovery and restoration that the remarkable regenerative capacity of your gut is fully capable of completing.